when I say I'm doing the story, that's the chance you really need to get out in front and have a response. And I don't know, maybe they thought, maybe they were surprised that the story was a front page story. I don't know, but I don't make those decisions anyway. I just said, here's the story, and then the editors would decide what to do with it. But the point being, they weren't prepared. They thought they could just write it out until they saw the story, and then they decided, oh my God, this is so negative, we got to do something about it. Well,
right.
You needed to anticipate that.
Welcome to On Top of PR with Jason Mudd.
Hello and welcome to On Top of PR. I'm your host, Jason Mudd with Axia Public Relations, and I'm joined today by a longtime contact of mine named Mark Basch. Mark is a seasoned business journalist who's covered publicly traded companies for decades. His reporting focuses on economic business trends, manufacturing, real estate, and unemployment, drawing regularly from data releases and press statements. And today we're talking about common mistakes companies make when working with the news media, and more specifically, publicly traded companies. So, Mark Basch, welcome to On Top of PR.
Oh, hi, Jason. Good to talk to you again. I've talked a lot over the years, but good to talk to you in this forum.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for taking time out of your schedule to help our audience. We love having journalists on our show because you bring unique insights and maybe some kind of behind the scenes feedback that would be valuable to our audience. And specifically today, I know we want to talk about companies that did a poor job of handling bad news and the consequences of doing that. And then we'll wrap up by talking about one particular example of a company that did a really good job as they were going through bankruptcy, in your opinion, of how they handled themselves and how that benefited them. And then we've got another thing we'll talk about towards the end, which I'm curious to explore with you, and we'll get to that later. But so Mark, let's start off. So you've got a couple of examples of companies that did a poor job handling bad news and the consequences of that. Let's start off with one of your examples.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to go way back in time here to the early 90s. And the example, I'm not going to name the company, but if you remember the early 90s, there were, if you remember the credit crunch, which started in 1990, and what happened was, commercial real estate developers found that they couldn't get bank loans anymore because banks were under pressure from regulators, and they basically just cut off the spigot, and so a lot of developers couldn't get loans. And as a result of that, there were a ton of foreclosures of major projects in the Jacksonville area. And one of my responsibilities back then was I was just going through the lawsuits that were filed in the courthouse, and I just kept coming across foreclosure suits filed against either, A, well-known developers, but also B, well-known projects and well-known buildings. And in a lot of cases, the companies had to lose their project, had to give up on their project. And it was very commonplace. So it was happening to a lot of companies. So the example I'm going to give is, there's one developer in particular who would never return my phone calls. There were I can't remember the number, but there were several foreclosure suits against his company, and he just wouldn't return the phone call. And my attitude at the time, as a reporter, my attitude was, okay, fine, I've got the court filing, I have all kinds of information here, so I have a story whether you want to respond or not.
Right.
And part of the message is the story is going to get written whether you want to respond or not. So at one point, I was contacted by his attorney, and he requested a meeting. We had a meeting with myself and my editor, and he wanted to come in with his attorney. I was like, okay, we'll do that. So we come in, and he has copies of a bunch of stories I wrote about other companies that were in the same situation. And his complaint was, these all, he showed me these things, and they all said, well, these seem a lot more positive than the stories you're writing about my company. And I before he got there, I didn't know what he was, what he wanted to talk, what he was going to say. But so I'm looking at all the stories, and I'm saying, you know what the common thread is here? Every one of these other stories, they sent a response to me. The response may have been, well, sometimes the response is just like, yes, unfortunately, we got caught in a bad situation and we're going to have to give up this project, or even to the extent of, well, we're hoping to work it out. We're not ready to comment at this time. And the point is, it's my responsibility whether sometimes in a lawsuit story, you're not getting the truth. Well, somebody wants to put their spin on it, but that's fine. I mean, and that's what you should be, and that's why I'm giving you the opportunity. And whatever you tell me, I'm going to add that to the story. I'm not going to. I don't go in with an agenda where I'm just, I want to write a negative story here. I'm trying to be fair and balanced, and I'm going to take your whatever the comment is, and add that to the story. So, and I sent that to him, and it was kind of interesting because actually they took it to heart, and they became more accessible going forward after that, where they would return my calls, in that situation, I'm glad that they came, that instead of sitting there and stewing about like why are these stories all so bad about me, they actually brought it up, and I had an answer. I mean, there was a very simple answer, and I told them, and they were like, okay, and it actually worked to we actually improved the relationship. So
that sounds like a really good opportunity to kind of inform and educate them about how the news cycle, the news process works. And as you were talking, I just wrote down a couple of notes. One, what you're reminding is our audience, I think, is the importance of participation, right? I mean, if you participate in the story, then you have a chance to, what I wrote down second is the opportunity to set the narrative, tell your story, and maybe even control a little bit about what's said. Otherwise, you are letting someone else tell the story, or a good journalist like yourself, Mark, is going to go find somebody who's willing to talk. And then something I learned very early in my career, Mark, was a quote that goes something like this: when you put your head in the sand, you show your rear, right? And so if you're going to act like, I guess an ostrich, when you stick your head in the sand, you're really just ending up showing your rear. I can think of a couple times, Mark, where a good journalist, would follow up with one of our clients who's, happens to be publicly traded. And they would say, look, my editor has told me if you're not willing to give me a statement, then I need to start calling board members, shareholders, and employees until someone talks to me. And that's pretty good motivation for, most of my clients to say, okay, we probably need to say something, because we don't want journalists calling board members. We don't want journalists calling leadership team members. And in this particular story I'm thinking of was literally like on Christmas Eve. So no shareholder or no board member wants a call about bad news about a company that they work with or invest in on Christmas Eve to interrupt their family time together, to hear, maybe for the first time, because the board doesn't even know what's happened yet, kind of thing. And our client was hoping to kind of keep it under wraps. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good motivator, because, I'm sure oftentimes journalists don't like calling people on Christmas Eve to, interrupt time to tell a story, but they're on call or they're on a shift and they've got to produce content. And if this is the best news story of the day, they're going to pursue it because they have an obligation to do so.
Yeah. I mean, it's also the fact that and even more so today than I used to, than it was 30 years ago when we didn't have the internet. The news breaks when it breaks, and it's going, it may be online instantaneously. So because that was also one of the lessons we're going to talk about is that you need to, whatever I'm calling you about should not be a surprise to you, because whatever's going on, you know what the story is, whether you wanted it revealed or not. So I think, when something is happening, it's a good idea to actually, preemptively get together with the key people and have a response ready, because one of the things that could happen in today's world is the story is going to be posted online, and nobody is ready to respond. And what do we do? What do we do? So that's there's a lesson there about knowing what is newsworthy and what's going. I say make the papers. And I hate saying that now because more often than not it's online. It's what's going to make the internet or something. But the point is to be prepared for that. You're going to get the questions and to respond in a timely manner, because that's I mean, honestly, it's a tough thing to wrestle with. That how long do you hold it waiting for a response before you say, okay, we got to go with it. We don't know if we're going to get a response or not. So that's just another lesson there.
Well, the good thing about online, right, is that you have the opportunity to revise the story as you get that input. The bad thing about online is the bad news stays there forever, as opposed to, back in the day, like people don't keep their print publications or don't have a library of past news articles very often.
Yeah, and actually that's just another, as an aside, that is an interesting point, is back in the day, okay, if the story in print had an error, you would write a correction. Okay, we have to write a correction. And the corrections would go on page 2 of the newspaper. And I think a lot, if the story that had been on page 1 or even just page 1 of the business section, the readers may not be used to looking at page 2 at the corrections. But today, when a story is posted on the internet, it gets corrected there and the original version is gone. And, if it was something really significant, there would probably be a little note that like the story was corrected from its original version. But
right.
But the fact is, hopefully, if you're looking up a past story, you're never going to see something that was incorrect or incomplete when you're looking it up on the internet. So, I mean, that's a positive part of that. So. Sure.
Okay, Mark. So let's talk about another story that you have of how a company did a poor job.
Okay. This was a family-owned business that was well known. I'm not going to mention it. It was well known about, mid 30 years ago. It's no longer in business. And it's not, well, sort of related to the story I'm going to tell, but the story is it was privately owned, family-owned. And there was a lawsuit involving the CEO and some other relatives of him, because they were descendants of the founder of the company, and shares were distributed among different family members. And the other family members thought the CEO was shutting them out, so they filed a lawsuit. Now, from my standpoint, the lawsuit itself was I don't need to hear the family squabble, and it may be salacious, but it's not something I really want to get into and try to figure this out. But the story really interested in me because it revealed financial data from this private company.
Right.
So that's what made it a good story as far as I was concerned, because like all the financial data was laid out there for a company that we never had seen financial data from before.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it was really interesting. And, I'm sure nobody, they didn't want this out there, but it was right there in the public documents filed in the courthouse. But the story I want to tell about the public relations aspect of this is, I did not follow the day-to-day, the back and forth filings and court proceedings and everything like that, because like I said, I was just not so interested in this battle, this family squabble. But when they got to the end of the case, and I don't think it was a jury trial, I think it was just a judge, and I didn't attend the trial, but then he issued his decision, which I read, and his decision was an absolute scathing rebuke of the CEO in favor of the other family members. And it was interesting enough that the story ended up being on the front page of the Times Union the next day. Now, I had called, like I said, okay, I don't want to take sides in a lawsuit. I never want to take sides in a lawsuit. It's just like, it's one side against the other and let the court decide.
Right.
But when the court decides, in this case, the judge, it seemed, I thought it was newsworthy, and there was a lot of money involved too. I can't remember, a huge settlement. So of course I tried to get the CEO or representative to return my, I wanted to hear from them. just, they wouldn't return the call. They wouldn't comment. So the next day after they saw the story in the paper, it's like the lesson is, okay, the story's going to be written anyway, so, and the next day when the story appeared in the paper, his public relations representative, who was actually a seasoned PR person, who I guess, I'm not going to mention any names, called me and said, well, the CEO is disappointed in your story, and he thinks the judge has really had many errors, and he wants to give you an exclusive interview, but
Okay.
only if you guarantee giving us a prominent place in the newspaper.
Huh.
And my response was, well, I can't guarantee you anything like that.
Right.
I don't even know what he's going to say, number one. And number two, the story was done today. I mean, the story is there. He had a chance to respond and he didn't. And and regardless, the story is going to heavily lean toward the judge because the judge is, obviously there are judges who have an agenda, but hopefully, I take it on faith that this judge was an impartial arbiter who made this decision. And I said, look, I'll talk to him, but I'm not going to guarantee you anything. And, and the lesson I'm trying to impart there is that, when I say I'm doing the story, that's the chance you really need to get out in front and have a response. And, I don't know, maybe they thought, maybe they were surprised that the story was a front page story. I don't know, but, I don't make those decisions anyway. I just said, here's the story. And then the editors would decide what to do with it. But the point being, they weren't prepared. They thought they could just write it out until they saw the story. And then they decided, oh my God, this is so negative. We got to do something about it. Well,
right.
You needed to anticipate that because you knew what the decision was from the judge. So you had to know how that story was going to portray him. So, and that's, that was sort of the lesson there. So.
Nice. Yeah, that's definitely a good lesson there. So again, participate so you can control the narrative a little bit, or at least represent your side of the story. Otherwise, people are going to assume, I think, the worst. If you're not participating in the story, then there's kind of like implied guilt or implied negativity. And I would also add that just simply, and then, they may or may not have the opportunity to have a second story told later when they decide to do it, because Mark, at the end of the day, is you're describing, but maybe not so clearly or specifically, I would say, is that there's still an editor involved who has to give you the yes or no, yes. Right? Number one. Number two, the placement of that story, or if the story even runs, depends on the quantity and quality of the conversation and how newsworthy their response is to later on. And I'm sure if I could kind of put on my crystal ball or whatever and kind of think about this, they're probably thinking, well, what you're hoping is the previous story was negative and prominent. Hopefully we can have a more neutral story told as prominently the next day or in the coming days, so that it pops or gets as many eyeballs or views as the other story, so we can kind of control that narrative a little bit.
Yeah. But also, it's like, I'm not just going to let you sit there and talk and tell your story. It's going to include what the judge said about it. I mean, we're going to have to repeat the original decision from the judge. So, it's a good point about, I would write the story. I might make a recommendation to the editor about how big it is, what they want to do with it, but it's up to them eventually. And also, and also when you're talking to a reporter that you want to give them the story and you say, we want a prominent place. Well, the reporter can't promise anything. And I'm thinking about this in terms of a newspaper. It's, I'm sure a lot of times now you're just talking to an independent journalist who is posting the story somewhere that maybe you can get some promises from them. For the most part, like I was not authorized to give you any promises about how much coverage you're going to get. So,
I think journalists are civilians, if you will, or corporations, executives, whatever it might be. Like, they don't know the whole process. Like, you might write a story and you leave at, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 o'clock, and somebody afterwards is editing that story. Somebody afterwards is writing that headline, somebody afterwards is inserting a photo and a caption. You might be involved or make recommendations depending on the outlet to some of that. But I know when I worked at this same newspaper, I tried to write headlines and they basically just said, stop writing headlines. We don't want you to even write the headlines. And I'm like, I would think that would be helpful if the person who wrote the story has some vision of what the headline could be. And oftentimes I'd give 2 or 3 options, and then eventually my hand just got slapped enough times that I just stopped doing it. So talk about that for a minute, Mark. Help educate our audience on that.
Yeah, I used to find that funny too, because I would, a lot of times I never saw the headline until I picked up the paper in the morning.
Yep.
And I was saying, oh my God, they got, and then a lot of times, even if I would get, and I would hear from a representative of some company and complain about the headline, and I said, look, I don't want to pass the buck, but I didn't write it. And they were like shocked, like, what?
Yeah,
so, no,
right.
Yeah, that's not how it works in a newspaper. The newspaper, I write the story, and a copy editor who may not understand the story, that was a real problem, especially with business stories for whatever reason. I don't know why they found them so hard, but they did. It has to fit the space that, in the printed newspaper, you had a specific space that you had where it had to fit. And
even in the digital era, you have a limited number of characters that a headline can fit in a story too.
Yeah, depending on the layout, of the webpage, yes. But and also they had, the copy editors would always, their greatest thrill was writing something they thought was really clever.
Right.
And they got really mad at me when I would come in the next day and said, "Well, this headline it's inaccurate. Like clever is great, but it better be accurate." And a lot of times it wasn't, so I would hurt somebody's feelings, and that's part. That was just part of the job. So I don't know.
Yeah, I love a clever headline as much as the next guy, but it needs to be reflective of the story. And especially, Mark, you and I know the danger is that oftentimes readers or consumers or viewer or audience members will skim headlines and not read the story unless the headline catches them. So the challenge is you've got oftentimes somebody doing a page layout who is maybe not really a good copy editor, who's trying to make it fit both to the limited space they have, but also make it be sometimes punny or attention getting or whatever it might be. And sometimes they get lost, I think, editing their work so much and revising it that they forget what the original foundational information was. And as a journalist and as a public relations practitioner, I've been disappointed in headlines for stories I've been involved in. And especially, as you said, when you see the headline the next day and you're like, wait a minute, this wasn't at all what I was thinking. Mm-hmm. So at least in the digital era, we have the ability to revise and perhaps debate and dispute and come to a compromise.
Yeah, and just take the headline discussion further. A lot has changed. One of the things that I really dislike is when I started in the business, the idea was the headline should give you an idea what it's designed to get you to read the story, but also should tell you what the story is. Where internet headlines are now designed to generate clicks, and so you'll see a headline. This is why this is happening, and I've gotten to the point where I just refuse to click on a headline or just Jacksonville company that does this but doesn't say what the company is, so I've reached the point where I just refuse to click on a story like that, because I said you're not telling me what the story is about whatsoever. You're trying to get me to click on it, and then so many times I click on it, and I'm just disappointed because it's like I'm not interested in this. And again, this is the business model: is you got to generate clicks, and we can go on and on about what's happened to the news industry, but that's the business news of the business model of news is not nearly the same as when we were young.
Well, decades ago, right? The newspaper would have a headline that would be the lead of the front fold, the top fold of the front page, and that would be to get people to put coins in the machine to get the paper out, right?
Exactly.
And now they're just trying to get people to click. And I'm with you. I get disappointed with misleading headlines or clickbait, as it's called, or the definition of breaking news that pops in my inbox, or I get a text message over, and I'm just, I'm literally yawning as I'm reading what they're calling, breaking news. And,
right.
One of my pet peeves is when a regional daily newspaper in a metropolitan area sends out a breaking news about the Oscar winners. And I'm like, I don't turn to your news outlet to give me one, entertainment stories nationwide because you are a local metropolitan newspaper, and two, I certainly don't want a text message at midnight telling me who won, an award of some sort, right? So, that can be very frustrating.
I actually do not sign up for news alerts because I just found out that you're getting you're getting texted all these things that you just have. It's like, I don't care about this.
Exactly.
There are certain news sites that I will just go to at certain, several times a day and see what their latest headlines are. And and I think I do get most of the news without ever being bombarded with news, whether I'm ready for it or not. So. Sure.
Okay, so I think you've got another story of a company doing a poor job. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, this is just a quick one. This involves a public company, which is no longer around. It's not because of this incident, but it really, this is a company that seemed to be a rising star in its industry, and a question came up about their accounting. To try to remember specifically what the accounting issue was, it's a publicly traded company, so of course they're releasing audited financial statements, and so to a large extent, I'm going to trust their financial statements that they release because the auditors are aren't going to do anything illegal, or obviously it happens sometimes, but for the most part, that's not going to happen. So this came out, and the stock that somebody was questioning their accounting, and their stock fell, and the company went into hiding. Now this is a public company,
right?
So, they just really, a company will go public, and they really need to. It's not to say public relations, but about investor relations. Like, I think a lot of companies don't even understand that when you go public, you need an investor relations plan, because you need to be able to respond to investor inquiries. And I mean, the media was also inquiring about this, but also they were not talking to their investors, or the large shareholders and the institutional shareholders. Mm-hmm. And the stock just fell for like a week before they actually emerged with some kind of statement. And it's just like, but then it was just too late. They didn't go, they didn't go out of business, but just like, the stock never recovered, which, again, then maybe they weren't prepared for this, because their original argument was that, yes, our accounting method is valid. And maybe they weren't prepared when somebody decided to publicly question whether it was valid. But again, once that came out, I think they had a responsibility to quickly, explain your position on the accounting issue, and don't let it sit for a week.
Without responding. Yeah.
A lot of people said, I mean, this is. It's not an objective analysis. It's subjective, that they really just, they didn't have a good investor relations function. And so the lesson there is, get your, when you're going public, be prepared for, especially, there's a lot of small companies that can probably get away with it, but, be prepared to have an investor relations, whether it's a person, whether it's a team, just have a plan for that. is the lesson there.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially as, like you're describing, as you're starting to think about IPO, now that's the time to start putting that plan together.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're not an investor relations firm. And I have to remind companies of that many times. It's like, well, you're a PR firm. Isn't that the same thing? And I'm like, no, not at all. There are PR firms that do investor relations, but most of the time you want an expert PR firm and an expert IR firm, and you want them working collaboratively. But to expect one or the other to be able to cover, it's just, you need a specialization because of the compliance and standards and requirements. The other thing, if I'm just on a soapbox for a minute, is, I feel like, having worked with several public companies, as have you, and you've covered several public companies, I don't think people really appreciate the overhead and cost of compliance to be publicly traded. And so when a company comes to me and says, oh, well, we want to be public in 3 to 5 years, I'm like, oh, do you think you'll get to $1 billion in 3 to 5 years? And they're like, oh, no, we don't think we'll be that big. And I'm like, well, then you probably don't want to be publicly traded unless you're $1 billion corporation, because of how difficult it is. But I think what they're looking for, we talked about the 80s and the 90s a little bit, they're looking for this big windfall that can certainly still happen when you go public, but in order to stay public and be public and comply with all the requirements, I really think you've got to really have a significant operation in place to be able to support and substantiate that. And sometimes working with publicly traded companies, I often, find it exhausting to think of as a shareholder how much of my share money, my investment in the company is just going to staying compliant. But that compliance also saves us as consumers making investments in corporations from, fraud and other activities that could harm, the public. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, you need that. But you're right. I've heard that all the time about the actual cost of compliance for public companies, and that people don't appreciate that. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So.
Yeah. I think a founder has this idea, I want to be public and, want to have a big payday when that happens. But, it's probably not sustainable. And then I think we've talked about this a little bit indirectly, but then the obligation you have to the public and to compliance and the market that you're trading in, becomes very high for the disclosures and everything like that. And a lot of times private corporations are not used to that level of transparency. And, one thing I will advise companies, if they're listening, that are private, that want to go public, I tell them, well, start acting like a public company now. Like, start being comfortable releasing your quarterly financials to the market, to the media, and see how much you enjoy doing that, and the stories and the criticism that come with that, because at any moment you can stop doing it if you don't like it. But to me, I tell companies all the time, especially private companies, that, hey, if you want to make this newsworthy, if you want to get media coverage about your company, its success and its growth, we've got to have credible indicators of how quickly you are growing. We just can't say, oh, well, we're growing really quickly, Mark. Mark wants to hear by a certain percentage as a minimum, but he'd really like to substantiate that with real dollars. And from anything that a company might be announcing, like, hey, we're moving into new office space. Well, what's the square footage? How many floors are you on? What's the cost per square foot? What was the lease details? Is it, a 10-year lease, a 5-year lease, 20-year lease? How did you negotiate the terms? What's the story behind the fact you're opening up a new office? We want to hear the business details of it and the transactional details. And I tell clients all the time, Mark, tell me if I'm giving bad advice. The more of that you share, the more the reporter has to tell a story with, versus Acme Inc. moved 5 blocks down the street and doubled their office space.
Yeah, you're reminding me of another story from the 90s about a company that had a product that introduced a product into the market that was very successful. So I wrote a story about it, and then they just kept saying, they want me more stories about it. And I said, well, you're private. I mean, you have to you're telling me, they'll say something like, oh, we grew 75%. Well, put some numbers on that. Yeah, I'm not going to write that unless you got to tell me your sales went from X to Y, and so let me calculate what the growth was. And I actually did, because I actually did get some to release some financial data, and this company isn't around anymore because it got bought out, but the product is still out there. But again, it's the same thing. It's just like, why aren't you writing about us? We're doing so well. Well, because you're private, and The company had an office, their headquarters offices here was a handful of employees while the product was manufactured somewhere else with a couple hundred employees. So I'm just like, okay, you're not growing local employment.
Right.
There's no local investors. So, the public interest in the story is just not that great unless you have to give me something different other than just say, we're doing great. Okay, but show me. So.
Yeah, exactly. You went to Northwestern, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went to Missouri School of Journalism, and I tell people all the time, look, I went to school at the Show Me State, so you got to show me, what we're talking about here. And it resonates even more today when we're in such a visual storytelling mindset of, just don't tell me, show me. Let's see, some infographics or charts or whatever it might be, seeing is believing, as the cliche goes. So.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Audible. Enjoy 30 days free of Audible Premium Plus by going to ontopofpr.com/audible.
You're listening to On Top of PR with your host, Jason Mudd. Jason is a trusted advisor to some of America's most admired and fastest growing brands. He is the managing partner at Axia Public Relations, a PR agency that guides news, social, and web strategies for national companies. And now, back to the show.
All right. I know you wanted to talk about a positive way a company handled their bankruptcy, and I think that that's obviously important for our audience to hear as well. So tell us more about that, Mark.
And I will tell you who it is, it's just because I thought it was a positive thing, and it's a significant company, Jacksonville, Winn-Dixie. And this was 20 years ago. It was 2005 when they filed for bankruptcy. And in some ways, it's kind of nostalgic because newspapers were still king in 2005. So what happened was they were going to file their bankruptcy. They were going to make the filing at night. And as it ended up, it was like midnight when they finally made the filing. And a little secret that I learned about bankruptcy is that the bankruptcy court never closes. You can file any time. And there's also a classic story about, people who have been around Jacksonville a long time will remember the Charter Company, which was a public company before I got here. It was in the early 80s. And then this was before the internet, but they were filing they wanted to file their bankruptcy late in the day. And apparently they just put it into a file and shoved it under the locked door of the bankruptcy court, which I closed for the day. But that was the only way to do it. But anyway, in Winn-Dixie's case, you could file it electronically, so you could do it whenever you wanted to. And their position was they wanted people to understand it, what this bankruptcy filing meant. And they also, at the time, I don't think they knew what, whether we would get the story if they didn't tell us in it. I mean, there were rumors that it wasn't a surprise that they were filing for bankruptcy because there was lots of talk about that. And their position was, that it was going to be late at night, and the first time people would know about this was when they picked up their Florida Times-Union the next day. They might be shocked by this thing. And so what they did was they offered, and I'm glad to accept, offered me and a couple other Times-Union people to go meet with them in that afternoon, with an embargo agreement, of course, that we're not going to release any of this until you actually make the filing and tell us it's okay to release it. But they laid it all out for us, and they told us, look, okay, we filed for bankruptcy, and this was my lead. I said, the stores are open today, and all employees should report to work as scheduled, because at that, obviously later on that there were store closings and there were layoffs and everything like that. But the idea of the Chapter 11 is you're going to reorganize. You're not going out of business. And I think people see bankruptcy and they think going out of business. So they wanted that message out there, and they wanted all their customers to know that, you can come to Winn-Dixie today. We're open. Employees need to come to work, and it ended up being a huge story on the front page of the Times-Union. And I know, when the filing was made, the Associated Press, which monitors everything, they were able to pick it up, that, and they put a story out there, which probably didn't make very many newspapers. I don't even know how many like local media would have gotten the story if we didn't have it in the Times-Union. And again, and this was a big company which had a lot of money. So they actually, they hired big money lawyers from New York who also brought in big money. And no offense, Jason, I mean, you're excellent at your job, but the big money PR guys from New York, were brought in to handle this whole thing, who might have had experience with this kind of thing. So they gave us the story. We got it, and I think it worked pretty well. That as far as informing the public, and the idea at the time was that most people would learn about this by reading the paper that day. I'm not sure where what a similar situation now, how that would work, because there is not a singular source where you're going to go to get this information, and also just the immediacy of the internet, that as soon as it gets filed, it's going to get reported, and that's got to be. I'm not sure what a good lesson is. I mean, I could have told you the lesson 20 years ago was this was a good way to do it. Call some reporters that you can trust to keep an embargo and say, here, this is the story. This is what we want to say. This is what we want people to know. I don't really know what the lesson is today about that, other than, again, be prepared that, be immediately available, I guess, to reporters, because there's going to be questions. And let's say, again, it was a Winn-Dixie kind of situation, something like that. You would just, I think what you would need to do is have a news release which goes out immediately coinciding with the bankruptcy filing to spell this stuff out and say, look, here's what's happening. No, we're not out of business. We're we're seeking a way to reorganize our debts, and hopefully we're emerge a stronger company in the future, and just get that all out there in advance. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Mark. A good coordinated, consistent messaged announcement cycle is very important, because what you don't want is to file the bankruptcy and then not have a follow-up statement to support it or whatever, or be preemptive. Even if that means, Mark, and I'm not sure that I would prescribe this, but even if it means you file for bankruptcy and you retain or withhold a news release until you're asked, or until you think that it's going to, make headlines. But, always prepare, always assume the worst, and have, proper preparations. Now, I do think, especially if you're a publicly traded company, you have to be transparent and you have to be proactive and preemptive. But if you're a private corporation, maybe you don't have to, but at least have it ready, like we say in the business, in case of emergency, break glass. And it just depends on the strategy and the approach that you're taking. I've worked with many companies over the years, and they might have some bad news to announce, and we're hoping no one notices it. We hope we can file with the SEC, or we can file with the state, or do whatever it is we have to do, and hope no one sees it. But almost always there's good journalists like yourself doing their job and staying aware and looking for the things that aren't being proactively announced. And, some newsrooms, some journalists are only taking the news that's being announced, and others are looking, around the corners. And, I think we both know a particular reporter who was notorious for walking the streets of the business district, to see who he could see and who was having lunch together and who was talking. And I'll never forget, one day I saw a leader of a somewhat well-known company walking into the offices of one of their direct competitors, and that got me thinking something might be happening there. And I called a buddy of mine at the newspaper who covers that beat, and he's like, yeah, I've heard reports of this too. And so we started kind of, working together to, start figuring out that these companies are probably merging together, and sure enough, they were. So, it's good to get from behind the desk and walk around and see what you can see.
Yeah, you just reminded me of a really good thing from years ago. PSS World Medical, which is a company you probably remember, and they got bought out by McKesson eventually. But
yep.
I happened to see something in a message board on the internet which said there were a lot of cars in the PSS parking lot over the weekend. And that should have been the clue, Yeah, there's a deal brewing. And they were, it's like I used to read these message boards mostly for fun, and that was just coming to me like, these people are onto something here. good one. So,
yeah, no, that's exactly right. In fact, a friend of mine, he worked at a competitor of PSS, and he said that's exactly when they went to sell. That's exactly what happened. Is he would get there early to make sure nobody came in on the weekend, nobody was there, and then he and other senior leadership from the company and the company acquiring them would meet at the office, and they would do tours, they would do inventory, they would look at equipment and everything else. And he just, kind of prayed that nobody decided to come in on a Saturday for, to catch up or forgot their jacket or something like that they needed. So yeah, it's very interesting how those kind of things work for sure. You wanted to also talk about, I have a note here, maybe we already covered it, but you mentioned an era where newspaper was still king. Is that something that you wanted to cover?
Well, yeah. I mean, that was sort, but that was what I was talking about Winn-Dixie, because the idea at the time was this was people's primary source of news. So and I think we just did cover that talk, because I wanted to talk about how it's changed as far as, what news outlets should you be concerned with about, because in the case of the Winn-Dixie bankruptcy, they decided the Times-Union was the source they had to get to first, to get their news out and to make sure they could get their side of the story out there. And that's actually just it. And I just what I wanted to say was, like, I wish I had a great answer for that now, and I don't. It's like where do you go these days to where would you turn to now? And I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. Obviously there are reputable business news websites, but I don't, and I write now for the Jacksonville Daily Record, and I don't know, if I don't know how many people would actually read a particular story of mine. You can tell how many daily clicks the Daily Record gets, but that doesn't mean they're going to see my story. With the Times Union, you know what the circulation was, and it's not only that you know how many papers are you selling, but there was the thing, the multiplier effect where, how many people are going to read that paper that was bought? Like, if the circulation was 180,000, like maybe 4 people are actually going to read that particular paper. So now we're over 700,000 that are going to read it. So, but when you're talking about how many clicks you're getting, I don't think people, you can't share a click, I guess is what so yes, the news site knows how many people are clicking on their stories, but from the standpoint of trying to decide where do you want the story to be seen, like I'm not sure that you wouldn't be able to figure out how many people are actually reading it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And even in the digital era, like you said, you can tell when people clicked on viewed a particular page on a website, aka a particular article. Mm-hmm. But just this morning, I was looking at an article on my phone and I passed it to my wife and she read it. And then I think one of my kids looked at it too. So, that's 3 viewers for 1 click or 1 view. And it's an imperfect science. It always will be, unless we really just forgo any privacy and there's some kind of face ID scan of each person that looked at it. But I mean,
of course, the cynical would say that's happening already, but
yeah. Exactly. So, Mark, you brought this up earlier. I think it's important we explore it in the short amount of time we have remaining, which is we've talked about on this podcast before, but not on this episode. Now, there's a lot of confusion around embargo, advance, and exclusive. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the most confusion is between embargo and advance. So I'd love for you to kind of educate our audience on your view of those 3 things and maybe, and this is off the cuff, of course, but maybe your best practices or recommendations for those approach and perhaps what people tend to get wrong with that. Because I've seen those go wrong quite often.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing about an embargo is, like, if you came to me and said the story is embargoed until whatever, these days it's actually, it used to be a day, but now I see more and more people want to embargo it until 12:01 on a certain day. It's just like, knowing again that people could read these, and especially like the way the way a lot of sites work, where you're turning over a new batch of stories at 12:01 on whatever day. But the key thing to know about an embargo is you need to make sure everybody agrees on it. Obviously, you need to trust the person you're asking to embargo the story. Number one, and hopefully people who you can trust, but also you need to get them to agree to it. And one of the issues we always have is what happens if somebody else gets a hold of this and breaks it before our embargo time?
Right.
And that's another thing we try to deal with somebody. So okay, but if the story gets broken somewhere else, especially something will come from a public document. Especially a good example would be new development projects in Jacksonville, where they usually come. There's a public record about them, and somebody could find the public record and want to write the story, and so you call the company who's not ready to talk about it yet, because I've heard this one before where people will say well, we don't want that revealed yet. And the response is, well, okay, but it's been filed at City Hall. Right. It's public. Yeah. Anybody can read this. So what are you going to say about it? So that's another part of it. Also, you just okay, if you want to give us an interview and give us the full story, you have to promise us you're not going to talk to anybody else until our story comes out. Because. And we won't, and it gets tricky because if somebody finds a document and writes a story and we're stuck because we haven't actually written the story, we're not going to be happy. It's not necessarily your fault, but it's, but again, we're going to need some kind of agreement in the embargo about that. Like one of the things is I'm okay getting beaten on a story which says this happened, okay, but I'd like to think I could put more context in it than that original story that somebody took a document and said this happened without having context to it, and hopefully people want to read it. So I'm okay with that, but again, it's just when somebody agrees to an embargo, if somebody else, whether they broke the embargo or they actually found the story and wrote it, we need to have that part of the agreement that as soon as it becomes public, we get to, we can go with the story.
Well, you're reminding me of a story that I'll just share real quick, where we were working with a publicly traded company. They had an announcement that was pretty big and significant. We were excited about it. It involved the local economic development organization where they were making some moves. And I don't think I can tell the story without saying it was a corporate relocation. So a company was moving from one market to another market. And we wanted to time it exactly in a way that wasn't in the news before the employees heard about it. And so, we being trusted advisors to our client, we kind of thought through this and we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to share the story with the market that they're moving to's, premier daily newspapers business editor for a Sunday placement. That was our vision. So we're going to tell them the story. We're going to do advanced interviews and all this, but they're going to agree to embargo it until Sunday's edition. They'll have it first, and then on Monday we were going to provide a special access interview with the CEO to a lesser known daily newspaper in that market. And then we were going to provide additional context and angle to the weekly business journal. And so the business journal would not have the story till the following Friday, but they'd have a deeper, dive, and we'd withhold some information just to kind of give everybody, a fair turn. And then the intent was then Monday, we would also do interviews with local TV stations, about the company moving. Everything was in place. Everything was perfect. We were really proud of what we orchestrated, Mark, because we felt like everybody was getting value and the timing was being managed. The problem was that the EDO's PR people were out having drinks with journalists that they used to be colleagues at the daily newspaper. And they just started getting loose and talking about, well, hey, this is happening, whatever. And so this was like Thursday night, they were out for drinks, and they're just, what's the saying, loose lips sink ships. And so they're running their mouth about it. And so those journalists go back into the office on Friday morning. They're like, hey, we heard about this. And then one of those journalists told another journalist. And so Friday morning, our agency's phones are blowing up because everybody's got the story now that we were trying to hold until Sunday or whatever. So I had to call my client and say, hey, if you haven't done that employee communication, you better press send right now. And the whole thing came crumbling down like a bunch of dominoes. And you better believe I had quite a conversation with those EDO PR people, about what are you doing running your mouth? This wasn't even your story to tell. We just were working with your offices and, letting you take credit. And they got all defensive about, well, it's just a careless accident, no big deal. And I'm like, it is a big deal because, the company's public, they had a process, we had a timeline, and you took the liberty of violating, because for them, candidly, they were new to the PR profession and were excited to be on the other side of, breaking news, and they just couldn't help themselves. So, my client was very upset. I was very upset because, candidly, some naive novices kind of didn't respect the process as diligent as we tried to be about it. And it all worked out, but when the Business Journal ran it as breaking news in their email, then everybody just went with it, and it just happens. And so it's lessons learned to have a plan, but have a plan in case the plan fails of what you're going to do secondarily. So,
well, it used to remind me that like one of the things to remind people, a lot of people don't understand is, people get uptight about disclosure for a public company. Like, like if you tell me something and tell me I can write about it, but you haven't actually filed a document. When I write about it, that is considered. I write about it onto, what website, whether it's a newspaper, that's considered disclosure. So you don't have to worry. Legally, when a member of the media discloses something first for a public company, that's a legal disclosure. If it came from the company. So it's not like, we can't talk about it and until we file our document. That's not true.
Right. They shouldn't be talking about it until they file their document, but they did. Yeah.
Yeah. It depends on the situation, but normally, if they had talked to a reporter, they know it's coming out, and they're like, okay.
Right.
But you don't have to worry like, oh my God, this is going to be in the newspaper. We better get out the disclosure. But no, it's actually legally, my story is the disclosure. So.
Gotcha. Mark, so did we address the difference between an embargo and an advance?
We didn't. I mean, I don't know if we're using the same definition because I would say, an advance is, I guess I kind of consider that sort of less serious. Like usually if somebody said they want to give you an advance, that they are talking about something they don't want published until a certain date. That's my experience. But you're right. You should choose your words carefully, make sure everything is clear. Like I said, without the embargo, you need both sides to agree to it. And it's sort of the same thing with it. With the advance, you got just the idea that you need for an advance, like sometimes somebody would give me some background information and say, like, we have this big announcement coming here. We want to give you this background, and may not give me the full story until it comes out. Like that's what I would consider to be an advance. But I don't know. But usually when people want to embargo something, they specifically say embargo. So that's my experience.
Yeah, by my definition, I'm going to say that that an advance is saying, Mark, I'm going to give this to you and your outlet before anybody else gets it. And you can start working on it now, but I want you to know you have it before everybody else does, as a professional courtesy or a strategic move on behalf of who we think our best audience is. Then
it's just like, yes, I mean, it's going to be publicly released and everybody and everybody can read it at that point. But you've given me more information in advance, is what? Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, I'm giving you a head start, whereas an embargo says I'm giving you a head start, but no matter what you're going to do with it, you can't go before noon on Tuesday.
Yes, and also I should also mention before an embargo is like, like on a public company, I want to talk to an analyst who covers the company. No, I cannot. Would you just say no? You can't call an analyst and give them a heads up on it because this is important. Or maybe with an advance, it might be a little less restrictive, or just like, I could call somebody to get some comments about this. Like, if this company was going to do this, what would you think, or something like that. But
yeah. And then even, to your point, you have to be very descriptive and communicate well about your intentions. So I've seen it where, a PR firm, any PR firm might say, we're giving, Mark, your traditionally a newspaper, an exclusive on this, right? But we're also giving an exclusive to another TV station, another radio station, like a non-competing format. Although in the digital age, everybody's competing against each other, I would say. But ultimately, I've seen that too. Or we've just most recently done something with the New York Times where we said, look, we're willing to give you this as an advance, but you have 24 hours. And if you don't do something with it, then we're going to go to the Wall Street Journal with it or something like that. And, I found that that's very clear, because if I just say, hey, Mark, I'm giving you this as an advance, and you sit on it or even as an exclusive, and you sit on it for weeks, and that doesn't align with our plan, then that doesn't work well. So again, to your point, it's all about good communication.
Yeah. Exactly. So.
And also understanding that you may come back and say, I'm just not interested in that, Jason, and so you have to.
It's like, and I would just say something when you want to pitch stories. It never hurts to send me an email. If I'm interested, I'll let you know. I mean, I don't, you just never know. So, and email, I consider email a really good medium to use for that, just because we don't have to waste each other's time. I can look at this thing and decide if I want to learn more about it, and you don't have to, you're not spending time calling and trying to convince me and everything. It's just like, okay, send me the email and I'll tell you if this is something I would write about or want to write about. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's also courtesy, professionalism, and all that stuff too. So, I think you'd rather have that opportunity to get an email than just be CC'd on an email that goes to 50 other journalists, right? So, I tell people all the time, it's time we put the relationships back into public relations, and that's one way to do it is to, instead of shotgunning everybody or spamming everybody, is to, have a one-on-one conversation to say, would this be something you're interested in? And just as a PR tip, you don't even have to say the company name. You could describe them. Hey, I've got a real estate company that's this size, that's doing this. Would you be interested in it? And that gives you enough, and your beat well enough. You can probably figure out who it is, but they haven't directly said who it is. So it gives you some parameters to go to an editor and say, is this something we want to do or no?
Yeah.
Well, Mark, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your experience and insights, wisdom with our team or with our audience. I know they will find it very valuable, and we appreciate you sharing. I'll be sure to put a link in the episode notes to some of your recent work, as well as share your bio and other experiences. But this has been a great conversation. I enjoyed catching up with you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. I mean, we've had conversations like this for the years. Just the first time we recorded it, so that's
that we know of.
That's true. Yes, good to talk to you, Jason.
Right. Yeah, that's right. All right, Mark, appreciate you very much. And with that, this has been another episode of On Top of PR with Jason Mudd. Thank you for the opportunity to share this with you and for your loyalty as an audience member of our show. If you found this episode valuable, please take a moment, share it with a friend or colleague you think would benefit from it. And we would appreciate you, and we appreciate the opportunity for allowing us to help you stay on top of PR. Be well.
This has been On Top of PR with Jason Mudd, presented by ReviewMaxer. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and check out past shows at ontopofpr.com.